Hello, good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the RSA to hear Mary Midgley talk about her brilliant new book, Are You an Illusion? I'm going to ask Mary a few questions, and I'm going to invite you to ask questions. And following the event, Mary will be signing copies of her book in the adjacent room. This is Mary Midgley's first book since 2010's The Solitary Self, Darwin and the Selfish Gene. If you haven't read Are You an Illusion yet, it's an invigorating tour de force. In 150 pages, she takes us from deep ocean plankton to the moons of Saturn, from the domestic virtues of wolves to the left brain thinking that killed Pliny the Elder on Mount Vesuvius. We go from Aristotelian teleology to MRI scans, by way of Marie Curie, Lynn Margulis, the composition of soil, 17th century automata, what was going through Napoleon's mind when he invaded Russia, and the enlarged hippocampi of London taxi drivers. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please join with me in giving a very warm welcome to Mary Midgley. Mary, I'd like to start by asking what led you to write Are You an Illusion in the first place?
Exasperation. With the doctrine going around for some time, largely from scientists, but also I'm afraid from some philosophers, that the self is an illusion, that you aren't really there. As Crick said, your joys and sorrows, your ambitions and memories and so on are just a lot of cells in your mind. Well, now, the trouble with this sort of talk, it does seem to me very serious, that it distracts people from thinking about their own lives in the direct way that they can from the data that they themselves are getting. It tells them, no, what you really need is some physical science or other, and at present it's these nerve cells. This distraction, this notion that science ahead of everything else will solve all your problems, what one calls scientism, has been on the increase for a long time, and I think it takes the place which perhaps some sorts of theology used to take, getting in the way of people thinking about what is directly around them and they should be thinking about. Is that an answer, Rob?
Yes, and in the book you say, I want to, it's something that flies in the face of current orthodoxy needs to be stated clearly. You say, minds can affect brains as well as brains affecting minds. Can you explain for us how that happens?
Yeah, I would be happy to start by doing that by talking about London taxi drivers. You know, some experiments done some years ago when the taxi drivers really did have to learn the whole of London by heart, found that their hippocampi were bigger than other people's. Well, you see, hippocampi are what we remember with. And it's a good test because the names of streets don't mean anything, so it's pure memory. And it emerged that these people, by learning this sort of stuff, were permanently affecting their brain cells. You see, the thing that's so hard to get the hang of here, I think, is that when we think one thing is happening, but we perceive it in two ways. We perceive it directly in consciousness, but it can also be perceived by people measuring the cells. The cells are doing something when we think. And these aren't two separate things. It's part of it really is the one thing. And the doctrine that matter affects mind and mind can't affect matter has been really very strong in our culture for the last more than a century. So that it makes us very hard to understand. And you see, not only the taxi drivers, but there are a lot of what they call biofeedbacks can be discovered. If I read New Scientist, I often come across some gadget or other which people are going to be controlling by thinking. They can control their blood pressure, you see, looking at a little graph to see where it's going. They can make their blood pressure go down. Well, this isn't the sort of thing which ought to happen according to the ideas which we were, I'm largely brought up on, but it does.
I should say that the same study also found that there's another part of London taxi drivers' brains, the amygdala, that's slightly smaller than it is for the rest of the population. I submitted a paper to the science journal Nature, arguing that this part of the brain is where a positive attitude towards multiculturalism is located. They didn't publish. I wanted to ask whether you think that this idea of an illusory self has gained the following wind from the popular superstition that we are lumbering robots controlled mind and body by our genes.
Well, you see, yes, because that line of propaganda certainly suggested that what we think of as ourselves, our joys and sorrows and so on, doesn't have any effect. It's all being done by the genes. The genes, that was about 40 years ago, wasn't it? Now it's much more the brain cells. But the story has the same bad effect, that people who have got to take decisions and think about how they're going to live are being told it won't make any difference, really. It's all just froth on the top. This is whatever. It's fatalism, you see, fatalism of a rather new kind. Fatalism used to involve saying there's something called fate, which is after you, but now it involves saying there are various gadgets inside you which are taking charge, and rather mysteriously they become active selves. You yourself cease to be one, and we thought the point of that was to say that nobody could be an active self, but somehow these little things pop up as substitute subjects. Does this make sense, yes?
I see how it leads to a certain sort of fatism, and I want to know whether the following example is on which side of the fence it is, whether it's on the side of minds affecting brains, or whether it's fatism. I noticed that in nominally progressive publications, particularly in the United States, such as, say, Mother Jones, there's been a rash of articles kind of celebrating studies that purport to have discovered that Republicans and Democrats have got different sorts of brains. There's a sort of if you've got the MRI scan, you can see there's a left-leaning amygdala, whereas right-wingers have got a more conservatively shaped amygdala. What's going on there?
Well, you might well ask. There's an awful lot of this kind of thing around. People are suddenly told that there's a scientific explanation for something which they had assumed all along. Now, one thing that might be interesting about this was to see whether simply to hear that the scientists are observing it from another angle. But what they are obviously, these people are obviously thinking is the real cause, isn't it, is in this. And this distracts, you see, this is the point I started from, this distracts people from attending to what they should be attending to when they think about right and left-wing people. What is the difference in their thoughts, in their lives, in their feelings, in the course of action that they'll take? The direct observation of the relevant goings-on is pushed aside because the idea is we've now got the scientific explanation, and that idea of the scientific explanation does seem to be a superstition, really, of the kind that should be much more often denounced than it is. And then the whole tone of that book of Crick's, which I've been quoting from, about you yourself, your joys and sorrows, and so on, is this very snooty I'm a scientist and you're not line, which makes people feel, oh no, well, I'm not, am I? You know. And what is often bad science and always irrelevant is pushed forward as being the true explanation. Yeah?
And that idea of a single true explanation famously has sort of disastrous precedences and disastrous consequences. And in our own time, in the book, you trace a link between, on the one hand, repudiating the self, and on the other hand, denying our complete and total dependency on the Earth's fragile life support systems. How does one follow from the other?
Well, this is very interesting. They are parts of the whole thing, same thing. You see, if you start seriously saying my subjective feelings and so on aren't real, what are you left with? You're left with an abstract observer, aren't you? You're supposed to be, because you're talking all the science, you see, you're supposed to be a cognitive object, something that knows things, but not connected to the things that you know. I mean, all this about human destiny and so on is out in the world. It's one of the things that you might know, but you, the knower, are not part of it. Now, if you're not part of it, you see, it's not going to matter to you very much if the whole planet gets destroyed. You see, you're not vulnerable. You're not related to the other creatures and people who are going to suffer. You're outside it. And I think, see, that in this notion of what it is to be scientific, which has really very strongly propaganded for a long time, the idea that you should be detached, you see, that you shouldn't be identifying with anything that you are looking at, that you should be, your pulse should not alter, as it were. If you have a pulse still, I don't know how you have, but you see, you shouldn't be moved by any of this. Because you are now this abstract observer, you're detached, so none of it matters. Does that make sense?
Thank you. And I'd now like to invite any questions from the audience. I'll take questions two at a time, and I'll preface this section with a line that James Shapiro, the great Shakespeare scholar, always says at this juncture. He always says, "I'll take any questions in the form of questions." Yeah. So, and I'll take them. I'll take them two at a time. I'll take them two at a time.
Repeat them,
oh, no,
yeah, because I'm deaf. Yes.
Yeah, two at a time. You and then you. Yes, sir.
Dr. Midgley, do you think that this idea of self as an illusion is to some extent one of these famous English irregular verbs, that nobody really believes that their self is an illusion, but it's frightening how easy it is to believe that certain types of other people's selves don't really exist? Whether in the past it was people with different races, whether now it's people of the wrong political persuasion whose opinions can therefore be discounted or dismissed. So is there in fact an even darker ideology perhaps lurking under this than the one that you've rather generously, I think, ascribed to some of the proponents of this view?
And can I take one more question, gentleman in the front row there?
Yeah, I'm not sure that detachment is ever possible. I like to propose the saber-toothed tiger test. You have someone who believes in the self, someone who actually does not believe, and the saber-toothed tiger is released at the same time. I don't think there would be any detachment in both of the people involved in that test.
The first, thank you both. The first question was, is it a sort of a kind of reflexive verb? When people talk about the self that doesn't exist, they actually really mean other people's selves don't exist. They never really mean their own self, and historically that's meant other races or people of other political persuasions.
Well, yes. I mean, I think that the self which is taken for granted as all right and still existing is the scientist's self. You know, there is no doubt about the scientists being in a position to tell you all this, and they express quite strong views about this and that in doing so. If one's going to pick on the minority, it's people in the arts and ordinary uneducated people. They don't really exist. You see, I think it's quite interesting that Crick phrases this in that your joys and sorrows and so forth don't exist. Of course, he says at some point this is true of all of us, but if he started by saying, I found that I don't, you see, it would have to be a different story. You can't go on from there, really. Yes, well, I didn't hear the other.
Sorry.
You've got a second answer here, a question here, haven't you?
Second question, he'd violated the James Shapiro rule, and he'd made a point, which he said, if